The sound wasn't a crash. It was a dull, wet thud that signaled the end of order. I watched, paralyzed, as the black soil spilled across the white oak chevron floor. It spread like a dark bruise on pristine skin. For a woman who made her living restoring high-stakes manuscripts to their original, breathless precision, saving history from the slow rot of time, this wasn't just a mess. It was an assault on the very architecture of my life. My chest tightened, a familiar, cold vice. The silence that followed the spill was heavier than the noise itself, expanding until it filled the sterile hallway with a sudden, suffocating pressure. Julianne stood in the center of my foyer, a disruption in human form. She didn't belong here. My home was a curated vacuum of temperature-controlled air and neutral tones, a sanctuary built to keep the unpredictable world at bay. Every surface was matte, every line parallel. Julianne, Jules, she'd insisted, was all vibrancy and chaos. She wore coveralls that had seen better decades, smeared with green chlorophyll and dark earth. She smelled of rain, peat moss, and something sharper, like crushed stems or wild mint. It was an organic scent, aggressive and alive, clashing violently with the filtered stillness of my hallway. "Oops," she said. Not an apology, a simple observation of cause and effect. The rare orchid she had been hired to deliver, a Paphiopedilum of specific lineage, lay sideways in its shattered terracotta. The plant was fine. My floor was not. I stepped forward, my movements calibrated, smoothing the front of my silk blouse. The invoice said white glove service. She laughed, a low, throaty sound that seemed to vibrate against the minimalist glass console table. "Gloves dull the touch," she countered. She dropped to her knees, ignoring the jagged pottery shards. Her hands were rough, nails cut short and lined with the evidence of her labor. She reached out, not to clean, but to touch the soil where it met the wood. I watched the way her shoulder blades moved beneath the heavy canvas fabric, the easy, fluid grace of someone who trusted gravity rather than fighting it. "Don't," I said. The word came out sharper than I intended. She looked up. Her eyes were an unsettling shade of hazel, flecked with gold, unflinching in their assessment. "It's just dirt, Elena. It washes off. Why are you so afraid of a little earth?" But it wasn't just dirt. It was foreign matter, invading a closed system. I looked at her hand, hovering inches from the white oak. The heat radiating from her was palpable, a sudden intrusion of biology into my archive. I felt a spike of adrenaline, the kind I usually reserved for a crumbling binding or a fading ink signature. It wasn't fear of the mess. It was fear of the unpredictable. She was an uncatalogued element, something I couldn't control. She pressed her thumb into the soil, smearing it further into the grain. "Rich nitrogen," she murmured, as if tasting the air. "Your floor is thirsty. Look how it drinks." "Please," I said, my voice dropping to that professional register I used for difficult board members. "Leave it. I have solvents." She stood up, dusting her hands on her thighs, leaving faint, ghostly handprints on the denim. "Suit yourself, but some things don't want to be cleaned. They want to be known." She left the orchid, a dark, brooding thing, its petals almost black. But she took the air with her when she walked out the door. The heavy oak portal clicked shut, sealing me back in my box. I stared at the spot. The soil was gone, scooped up by her chaotic hands, but a dark, jagged shadow remained. I retrieved my kit, pH-neutral cleansers, microfiber cloths, the tools of my trade. I poured the solvent, rubbing in circles, then with the grain. I applied pressure with the exact calculated force required to lift pigment without damaging the substrate. Nothing happened. The stain stared back, stubborn and permanent. It wasn't just a mark on the floor. It was a bruise rising from beneath the skin of the house. I retreated to my study, needing the comfort of solvable problems. I had a manuscript on the desk, a 17th century navigational chart that required stabilizing. This was my domain, the controlled arrest of decay. I picked up my scalpel, the weight of the steel familiar and grounding. I adjusted the magnification lamp, narrowing my world down to a single square inch of vellum. But the silence, usually my partner in these late hours, felt thin. My eyes kept drifting from the delicate ink coastlines to the open door, drawn by the memory of the stain in the hallway. It was a black hole in my peripheral vision, pulling at my focus. The uncertainty of it sat heavy in my gut. I couldn't predict how deep it went. I couldn't predict if it would spread. I set the scalpel down. The precision I prided myself on was slipping. I walked back to the foyer and crouched over the damage. Under the harsh light of the chandelier, I saw what I had missed in my panic. The soil hadn't just stained the wood. It had reacted with it. The tannins in the oak were interacting with whatever chemical compound was in that black earth. It wasn't a mess. It was chemistry. A living reaction. To neutralize it, I couldn't just scrub. I needed to understand the agent. I needed the formula. I told myself I needed the data to save the floor. I grabbed my coat. I drove to the address on the crumpled invoice. The hothouse. The name felt like a warning. The building sat on the edge of the industrial district, an old Victorian glass structure wedged between two steel warehouses like a forgotten memory. It was breathing. That was the only way to describe it. The glass panes were opaque with condensation, glowing with a soft, diffused green light from within. Even from the street, I could feel the energy radiating from it, a humid, biological pressure pushing against the cold city air. I stepped out of my car, and the scent hit me before I even reached the door. It smelled of wet bark, crushed stems, and the deep, musky sweetness of decomposition and growth. It was the smell of life happening all at once, aggressive and unfiltered. I pushed open the heavy door, and the atmosphere swallowed me whole. The air was thick, heavy with moisture and oxygen, the kind that sits in your lungs. The temperature was 10 degrees higher than the world outside. My eyes adjusted to the dim, filtered light. It was a jungle. Vines climbed the iron rafters, hanging down in thick, verdant curtains that brushed against my shoulders. Ferns the size of umbrellas crowded the narrow aisles, their fronds unfurling like slow green fingers. There were no clean lines here, no categorized sections or clear pathways. It was a riot of biology, a deliberate anarchy of leaf and root. I felt overdressed in my structured wool coat, a rigid gray line in a world of curves and chaos. Somewhere in the back, water dripped with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. I felt the humidity settle on my skin, ruining the sharp lines of my hair, softening the edges I worked so hard to maintain. I should have turned around. I should have accepted the floor as a loss. But the pull was undeniable. A brass bell chimed above me, announcing my entry into the green dark. Jules didn't ask why I was there. She simply emerged from behind a wall of monstera leaves, wiping damp soil onto her hips. She looked at me, then at my hands, which were still clenched in my pockets, protecting my own sterile environment. The oak rejected the solvent, she stated, not as a question, but as a diagnosis. She didn't offer an apology for the damage. Instead, she seemed delighted by the rebellion of inanimate objects. She moved to a cluttered workbench, bypassing the commercial cleaners I would have reached for. She began filling a small glass jar with strange, unlabeled compounds. A dark, viscous oil, a pinch of something that looked like ash, and a thick, amber wax. "You can't erase a reaction like that, Elena," she said, her back to me. "You have to finish the conversation the soil started." The drive back to my apartment was silent, but the air inside the car felt altered. Jules sat in the passenger seat, her knees drawn up, looking out the window with the casual intensity of someone who finds patterns in concrete. When we walked into my foyer, the stain was waiting, a dark accusation on the pale floor. I expected her to get to work immediately, to fix the error and leave. Instead, she sat down. She didn't kneel or crouch. She sat cross-legged right on the chevron pattern, patting the empty space beside her. "Sit," she ordered softly. "I can watch from here," I said. My instinct was to hover, to supervise, to maintain the vertical advantage of the archivist over the artifact. "You need to provide the friction," she countered, unscrewing the jar. The smell hit me instantly. Clove, heavy and medicinal, mixed with the deep, resonant scent of wet earth. It was a smell that didn't belong in a high-rise. It belonged in a root cellar or a forest floor. "Come down here, Elena." I lowered myself slowly, tucking my legs beneath me, maintaining a precise distance. I was conscious of the silk of my trousers touching the floor, a violation of my own rules. Jules dipped a rag into the mixture and handed it to me. Circular motions, she instructed. Hard. You have to generate heat. I began to scrub. The wax was thick, resisting my efforts. I focused on the mechanical action, the rotation of my wrist, trying to ignore the woman sitting inches away. But Jules was impossible to ignore. She leaned in, watching the wood grain with an intensity that felt voyeuristic. I could feel the heat radiating from her, a physical weight that pressed against my side. She smelled of that greenhouse humidity, a damp green warmth that made the air in my hallway feel thin and recycled. Harder, she murmured. You're petting it. You need to change it. My arm was burning. I am applying significant pressure, I snapped, frustration leaking into my voice. No, she said. Like this. She didn't ask for permission. She reached out and covered my hand with hers. Her palm was rough, the skin thickened by work, warm and dry. Her fingers wrapped around mine, trapping my hand against the cloth. The contact was electric, a sudden circuit closing. I stopped breathing. The shock of it wasn't just the touch. It was the control. She guided my hand, forcing a rhythm that was slower, deeper, more deliberate. We moved together, a single machine of bone and intent. I watched our hands, my pale, manicured fingers disappearing under her earth-stained grip. The friction built, a physical heat rising between the wood and the cloth, mirroring the sudden, flushing heat climbing my neck. Feel that? She whispered. Her face was dangerously close to my ear. The wood is opening up. I stared at the floor. Under the heat and the oil, the black stain wasn't disappearing. It was deepening. The harsh, jagged edges were softening, blending into the surrounding grain. It was no longer a scar. It was a shadow, a depth, a rich, dark patina that looked like it had been earned over a century, rather than inflicted in a second. There, she said, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating in her chest. She didn't let go immediately. Her hand lingered over mine, a heavy, anchoring weight. For a second, the silence stretched, taut and heavy, charged with everything we weren't saying. I was acutely aware of the pulse in my wrist, beating against the heel of her hand. Then she pulled back. The loss of warmth was instant and jarring. I sat back on my heels, breathless, as if I'd run a mile. The floor was changed. The stain was still there, but it was no longer a flaw. It was a feature, a dark, intentional mark of history. Jules capped the jar, her movements easy and loose. Now it has a story, she said, standing up and offering me a hand I didn't take. I couldn't. I stayed on the floor, looking at the dark wood, realizing with a sinking, terrifying certainty that the stain wasn't the only thing that had been permanently altered. The air in the room had shifted, charged with a new, volatile chemistry I didn't know how to archive. The silence of my apartment had always been my greatest achievement. I had engineered it, soundproofing the walls and triple glazing the windows against the city's chaotic hum to create a perfect, static void. But in the days following the floor incident, that silence began to curdle. It no longer felt like peace. It felt like a vacuum. I would sit in my Eames chair, a glass of water resting on a slate coaster, and feel the stillness pressing against my eardrums, demanding to be filled. My eyes kept betraying me, sliding away from the clean, parallel lines of my furniture to that dark, oiled patch on the floor. It was a disruption, yes, but it was also an anchor. It was the only thing in the room that possessed any gravity, the only surface that felt like it held a secret. The orchid sat on the console table, its dark, alien bloom mocking the neutral palette of the room. It looks perfectly healthy. The leaves were turgid, the stem strong, the color deep and vital. But I saw a yellowing at the edge of a leaf, a subtle droop in its posture that wasn't there the day before. It was enough. I returned to the hothouse on a Tuesday. The day was gray, the city flattened by a low, oppressive sky that promised rain but refused to deliver it. But inside the shop, the light was amber and thick, filtered through layers of condensation and chlorophyll. Jules was behind the counter, wrestling with a massive staghorn fern mounted on a board. She wore a tank top that revealed the strong, corded muscles of her arms. Her skin sheened with the humidity of the room. When the bell chimed, she didn't look up immediately. She finished tying a knot with her teeth, a casual, feral gesture that made my breath hitch in my throat. "It's dying," I announced, placing the orchid on the scarred wooden counter between us. Jules wiped her hands on her jeans and leaned in. She didn't look at the plant. She looked at me. Her gaze was slow, deliberate, reading the tension in my shoulders before she finally turned her attention to the pot. She touched the leaves with a gentleness that unnerved me, her fingers tracing the veins like she was reading Braille. "It's not dying, Elena," she said, her voice dropping into that low register that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my chest. "It's suffocating." She lifted the pot, tilting it so the drainage holes faced the light. "Look at the roots." She pointed to the bottom, where thick, white tendrils were coiling tightly, climbing over each other in a desperate, tangled mass. "It's root-bound. It's grown as much as it can in this space. Now it's just circling, strangling itself because it's terrified to breach the perimeter." I looked at the tangled roots, white and fleshy, pressing against the clay. "It needs a bigger pot," I said, my voice sounding thin in the damp air. "I can buy one, something ceramic, minimalist." Jules shook her head, a slow, rhythmic movement. "It doesn't need new furniture. It needs release. The roots have fused to the clay. If you pull it out now, you'll tear them apart." She picked up a heavy iron trowel, weighing it in her hand. The metal was dark, pitted with rust. "You can't save the structure and the life, Elena. You have to choose. To let it grow, we have to break the pot." She looked at me then, her eyes locking onto mine. The challenge was explicit. She wasn't talking about the plant. She was asking if I was willing to shatter the hard, protective shell I had built around my life. She was asking if I was brave enough to be messy. "It's a vintage terracotta," I murmured, a weak defense of the container, of the rules. "It's a coffin," she corrected softly. She set the trowel down with a heavy clank. "The plant is screaming. Can't you hear it?" I looked at the pot. Perfect. Symmetrical. Hard. And inside, a living thing slowly choking on its own safety. I looked at Jules. She was waiting, not pushing, just holding the space for me to step into the danger. "Do it," I whispered. Jules didn't hesitate. She brought the handle of the trowel down sharply against the rim of the terracotta. The sound was a dull, sickening crack, like a bone snapping. The pot didn't explode. It simply gave up, falling away in 3 large, curved shards. What remained on the counter was the naked truth of the plant, a dense, pale mass of roots, woven so tightly together they had taken the exact shape of their prison. They looked vulnerable, exposed, a tangled white anatomy that had never seen the light. "There," Jules said, brushing the clay debris aside with the back of her hand. A cloud of fine red dust rose into the humid air, settling on the sleeves of my cashmere sweater. I didn't brush it off. I was too busy staring at the exposed roots. They looked painful, a claustrophobic knot of living tissue. "Now comes the surgery. You have to loosen them, Elena. You have to tell them they don't have to hold that shape anymore." She pushed a mound of fresh potting mix toward me. It was dark, almost black, composed of bark, charcoal, and moss. I looked wet. "Go on," she challenged, her chin tilting toward the mess. I hesitated. My hands weren't insured. My hands handled dry paper, cured vellum, and sterilized tools. They did not touch wet, decaying matter. But the challenge in her eyes was a physical weight. I reached out. The soil was a shock, cold, damp, and gritty. It felt shockingly alive against my skin, a stark contrast to the dry, dead history I usually touched. I dug my fingers in, the mixture clinging to my nails, staining the cuticles dark. I reached for the root ball, my movements tentative. I tried to pry a single root loose, but it was fused to its neighbor. I was terrified of snapping it. "I can't," I said, pulling back. "It's too tight. I'll break it." "You're thinking like an archivist," Jules murmured. She moved then. She didn't walk around the counter. She rounded it, closing the distance between us until she was standing just behind my right shoulder. The air around me changed instantly, the temperature spiking. She smelled of crushed basil and sweat, a sharp, intoxicating salinity that made my mouth water. "You're trying to preserve the structure. You need to dismantle it." She reached around me. Her arms bracketed mine, creating a sudden, temporary cage of flesh and heat. She didn't touch me, not yet, But the proximity was a physical pressure. I could feel the heat radiating from her chest against my back, a steady, furnace-like warmth that leached through my clothes. "Here," she said. Her voice was right at my ear, a low vibration that traveled down my spine. She covered my hands with hers. The contact was absolute. Her palms were rough, callous maps of her labor, warm and dry against my cold, mud-slicked skin. She didn't just hold my hands, she commanded them. She pressed my thumbs into the center of the root ball, applying a pressure that felt dangerous. "Don't pull," she instructed, her breath ghosting against the sensitive skin of my neck. "Massage. You have to convince them to let go." She guided my fingers, working them deep into the tangled white mass. It was an intimate, rhythmic motion, pushing, teasing, separating. I was no longer in control of my own motor functions. I was an extension of her intent. We worked in silence, the only sound the wet squelch of the soil and the heavy, ragged cadence of my own breathing. She knew exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly where the tension lay. "See," she whispered. "It's opening." The root ball was loosening, expanding, taking a new, chaotic breath. But my focus had narrowed to the sensation of her body pressed against my back. She stopped moving, her hands stilled over mine, burying us both in the soil. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She wasn't pulling away. She was waiting. I pulled my hands away abruptly, the motion jerky and ungraceful. I stepped back, bumping into the counter behind me, putting 3 feet of safety between us. My hands were black with soil, shaking. I stammered, my voice brittle. "That should be sufficient." Jules stood there, her hand still hovering over the plant, empty now. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, heavy with something I wasn't ready to name. "Yeah," she said softly, watching me wipe the mud onto a rag with frantic scrubbing motions. "It's free now." I grabbed my bag, leaving the orchid, leaving the mess, leaving the heat. I walked out of the shop without looking back, but I could feel her gaze on my back, a tactile weight that followed me all the way to the safety of my car. I gripped the steering wheel, my clean hands trembling, realizing that while the plant might have been repotted, I had been the one unraveled. I tried to bury myself in the geography of the past. I retreated to the museum basement, to the climate-controlled vault that housed the collection's most vulnerable cartography. The air down there was scrubbed and recycled, kept at a constant 68 degrees with 40% relative humidity. It was a tomb for things that were too precious to be touched. I sat at my workbench, the harsh, shadowless light of the magnification lamp illuminating a 17th century maritime chart of the Pacific. It was a masterpiece of ink and optimism, drawn by men who thought the world could be measured and contained. I pulled on my white cotton gloves. Usually, this ritual centered me. The gloves were a second skin, a layer of professional detachment that allowed me to handle history without contaminating it with my own biology. But today, the cotton felt abrasive. It felt like a lie. As I reached for the bone folder to smooth a crease in the vellum, my hands felt heavy, clumsy, and strangely hot. I couldn't stop replaying the sensation. My skin felt sensitized, humming with a residual charge that the sterile air of the archive couldn't dissipate. I looked at the map, at the clean, sharp lines of the coast, and all I could see was the tangled, chaotic white mess of those roots. I dropped the bone folder. It clattered against the table, a shocking noise in the silence. My hands were shaking. Not much, a tremor invisible to anyone else, but to me, it was a seismic event. I was losing my calibration. The entropy I fought so hard to keep out of the archives was bleeding into me. My phone buzzed against the metal desk, vibrating with an urgency that made me jump. I picked it up, grateful for the distraction, until I saw the alert. A severe weather warning. The barometric pressure was plummeting. A storm front, unseasonably violent, was rolling in off the coast, bringing gusts that threatened to tear down power lines and strip the autumn trees bare. I looked out the high, narrow window at the top of the wall. The sky, usually a sliver of polite gray, had turned a bruised, sickly purple. The wind was already picking up, whistling through the ventilation shafts of the building like a low moan. My apartment was safe. It was a fortress of steel and reinforced concrete, located on the 14th floor, well above the floodlines and the chaos. I should go there. I should go home, order takeout, and wait for the system to rebalance itself. But then I thought of the glass. The image hit me with the force of a physical blow. The hothouse. It was a Victorian relic, a cathedral of fragile, single-pane glass held together by drying putty and rusted iron. It was a structure built for light, not for resistance. It sat exposed on that industrial corner, surrounded by wind tunnels, completely vulnerable. I told myself it was about the orchid. But I stripped off the white gloves, throwing them into the bin with a violence that surprised me. I wasn't worried about the plant. I packed my bag in 30 seconds. I didn't file the map away properly. I just covered it with a sheet of acid-free tissue. A sloppy, temporary measure that would have horrified me yesterday. I ran to the parking garage. The city was already emptying out, commuters fleeing the coming deluge. The air in the garage was thick and electric, smelling of ozone and exhaust. When I drove out onto the street, the wind hit the car immediately, a solid wall of force that shuttered the frame. Debris was already dancing in the gutters. Newspapers, coffee cups, dead leaves, swirling in chaotic, rising spirals. I turned the car away from the safety of the uptown district and headed toward the river, toward the industrial, crumbling edge of the city. The sky opened up just as I hit the highway. It wasn't rain, it was a deluge, hammering against the windshield with a violence that blurred the world into streaks of gray and red taillights. The wipers thrashed back and forth, fighting a losing battle against the water. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was driving into the eye of the disorder, abandoning every protocol I had ever written for my own survival. I was seeking out the uncertainty. And God help me, the closer I got to the glass house, the more alive I felt. I arrived just as the sky finally tore open. I parked the car at a sharp angle on the curb, the headlights cutting through the deluge to illuminate the hothouse. It looked like a ship listing in a dark ocean, the glass walls flashing white with every strike of lightning. The power was already out. Inside, I could see shadows moving frantically against the translucent panes. One shadow, fighting a losing battle against the wind. I didn't think. I ran. The wind hit me like a physical hand against the chest, shoving me back. But I pushed through, my coat soaking through instantly, the cold rain plastering my hair to my skull. The door wasn't locked. It flew open, caught by a violent gust that rattled the entire iron frame, and I stumbled into the chaos. The sound inside was deafening. It wasn't the polite drumming of rain on a roof. It was an assault. The water hammered against the single-pane glass with a relentless, percussive roar that drowned out thought. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, cold rain, and the sharp green scent of distress, crushed stems, bruised mint, and the metallic tang of fear. Jules was a silhouette in the flashes of lightning, wrestling a massive bird of paradise away from the vibrating front windows. She didn't look like a gardener now. She looked like a captain trying to secure cargo in a hurricane. I didn't speak. I dropped my bag into a puddle and grabbed the other side of the heavy clay pot. She looked up, hair plastered to her face, eyes wide and dark in the gloom. She didn't ask why I was there. She didn't smile. She just nodded, a sharp, utilitarian jerk of her chin. "Back wall," she yelled over the thunder. We moved. For the next hour, we were a single unit of desperate efficiency. We dragged heavy citrus trees across the concrete floor, the friction screaming against the roar of the wind. We moved trays of seedlings, hanging baskets that swung dangerously, and heavy bags of soil that leaked black mud onto our clothes. My cashmere was ruined, soaked and heavy, clinging to my skin like a second freezing layer. My muscles burned with a lactic fire I hadn't felt in years, my hands slipping on wet terracotta. But my mind was silent. There was no room for anxiety, no space for the archive or the preservation of order. There was only the weight of the clay, the slick floor, and the rhythm of Jules's breathing next to mine, harsh, ragged, and alive. A branch from the street slammed into the roof, a terrifying crack that sounded like a gunshot. Glass shattered somewhere in the front, followed by the hiss of wind rushing in. "Office," Jules commanded. She grabbed my wrist, her grip wet and iron hard, and pulled me toward the back of the shop. The office was a tiny, windowless box cluttered with invoices and seed packets. She kicked the door shut, sealing us in a sudden, ringing silence. The storm was still raging, but muffled now, a distant monster clawing at the walls. It was pitch black, save for the blue-white strobing of lightning through the cracks in the doorframe. We stood there, chests heaving, dripping water onto the linoleum. The space was too small. The air was instantly hot, charged with the humidity of our exertion and the smell of wet wool and adrenaline. "You drove through a flood warning," Jules said. Her voice was rough, stripped of its usual playful lilt. She clicked on a flashlight, setting it on the desk so the beam hit the ceiling, casting long, jagged shadows across her face. "The structure is unstable," I countered, leaning against a filing cabinet, trying to steady my shaking legs. "Glass isn't meant to take this load." "The glass is tempered, Elena. It bends." She stepped closer. The space between us evaporated. "Why are you here?" "I told you. The structural integrity." "Bullshit," she cut me off, stepping into my personal radius. The heat radiating from her was intense, a furnace against the cold dampness of my clothes. "You hate the mess. You hate the noise. Why did you run into the middle of it?" I looked at her. Water dripped from her nose, her eyelashes. She was a wreck. She was beautiful. "Because I couldn't archive it," I whispered. The confession felt like a surrender. "I couldn't file you away. You're a variable I can't isolate." "I'm not a variable," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than the thunder. "I'm the only real thing that's happened to you in 10 years. The tension snapped. It wasn't a decision. It was a collision. I didn't know who moved first. One moment we were arguing, and the next, her hands were in my hair, wet and heavy, pulling me down. My hands found the lapels of her soaked jacket, gripping the fabric like it was the only solid thing in the world. The kiss wasn't gentle. It had no precision, no technique. It was desperate, a clash of teeth and breath and hunger. It tasted of rain and salt. It was the physical manifestation of the storm outside, chaotic, overwhelming, and terrifyingly necessary. She pressed me back against the filing cabinet, the metal cold against my spine, her body a wall of heat against my front. I opened to her, not just my mouth, but everything. The walls, the archives, the carefully curated silence. It all shattered. I felt the precise texture of her intention. There was no hesitation in her, no uncertainty. She held me like she was rooting me to the spot, like she was planting something deep in the dark soil of my chest. We broke apart only when we needed air, gasping, foreheads resting against each other. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into total darkness. But I didn't care. The storm raged on, but in the dark, messy center of it, I finally felt steady. I woke up to the smell of cold coffee and damp cardboard. My neck was stiff, a dull ache that radiated down my spine. A souvenir from sleeping on a pile of shipping blankets on the hard linoleum of the office floor. The light filtering through the crack in the doorframe was gray and watery, lacking the sharp, defined edges of the morning sun I was used to. In my apartment, morning was a sequence of automated blinds rising at exactly 6:30 a.m. to reveal a filtered view of the skyline. Here, morning was just the slow, inevitable return of visibility to a world that felt stripped and raw. I sat up, pushing the heavy, scratchy wool blanket aside. My clothes were dry but hopelessly wrinkled, stiff with the memory of the rain and the sweat of the storm. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the tangles, the lack of product, the absolute disarray of my presentation. The old panic flared for a split second, the instinct to find a mirror, a shower, a comb, to restore the facade before facing the world. But then I looked at the empty space on the floor where Jules had been sleeping. The blanket there was thrown back, a ghost of her shape still impressed in the fabric. The panic subsided, replaced by a heavy, warm gravity in my center. I didn't want to fix the mess. I wanted to see her. I stepped out of the office and into the wreckage of the shop. It looked like a battlefield, where the losing side had fought with flowers. The floor was a mosaic of shattered terracotta, wet leaves, and spilled potting soil. A massive branch had punched through a pane in the roof, lying amidst the crushed ferns like a fallen soldier. The air was cold, much colder than yesterday, smelling of crushed green things, wet concrete, and the metallic tang of the city drying out. Jules was standing near the broken front window, sweeping shards of glass into a pile. She wore a thick, oversized flannel shirt over her tank top, her hair pulled back in a messy knot that defied structural engineering. She stopped when she heard the crunch of my boots on the grit, leaning on the broom handle. She didn't smile, not exactly. It was smaller than that. A softening of the eyes, a relaxation of the tension in her shoulders. "The roof held," she said, her voice raspy with sleep. "Mostly." I walked over, stepping carefully over a decapitated begonia. "It's a disaster," I said, looking at the carnage. My archivist brain was already cataloging the losses, calculating the insurance claim, the restoration hours, the sheer volume of entropy. "No," she corrected, picking up a pot that had cracked down the middle. The plant inside was bent, daubed with mud, but unbroken. "It's just pruning." Nature's a violent editor, Elena. Sometimes you have to lose the dead weight to get the new growth. It looks messy, but the roots are stronger for it. She handed me a mug she'd retrieved from the counter. It was chipped at the rim, the ceramic warm against my cold fingers. The coffee was black, strong, and bitter. It tasted like the ground. We stood there in the debris, sipping in silence. It wasn't the silence of my apartment, that pressurized, empty quiet that demanded perfection. This was a companionable silence, filled with the dripping of water from the leak in the roof and the distant, rhythmic swoosh of cars returning to the wet streets. "I should help you clean this," I said, gesturing to the sea of mud. "You have a job," she reminded me, watching me over the rim of her mug. "You have a manuscript to save, a floor to keep perfect." My phone buzzed in my pocket, a sharp digital intrusion that made me flinch. I pulled it out. The screen was bright, offensive in the dim light. A notification from the museum. "Urgent, climate control alert, Section 4. Another from my contractor. Floor refinishing quote attached. The screen glowed with the promise of order. I could leave right now. I could drive back to the sanitized air of the vault, put on my white gloves, and pretend the storm never happened. I could fix the floor until the stain was just a memory. It was the safe choice. It was the precise choice. I looked at Jules. She was watching me, unflinching, waiting to see which version of me had survived the night. I looked at the mud on my boots. I looked at the chaotic, broken, beautiful mess of the greenhouse. I swiped the notifications away. The screen went dark. "The manuscript can wait," I said, slipping the phone back into my pocket. "And the floor, I think I'm starting to like the stain." Jules grinned then, a true, bright expression that lit up the gray morning. "Grab a shovel," she said, tossing me a pair of heavy work gloves. "We've got work to do." I brought the chaos home in a cardboard box. It was a humble container, damp at the corners, filled with the survivors of the storm. Cuttings of philodendron and 3 small pots of ivy that Jules insisted needed a quiet recovery ward. I set the box on the pristine white marble of my kitchen island. A dusting of dark peat moss fell, settling against the stone like black snow. 10 days ago, I would have panicked at the breach of containment. Now, I just traced the scatter of dirt with my fingertip, feeling the grit. It wasn't a mess. It was evidence of life. It was a reminder that growth is inherently dirty work. I walked out to the foyer, drawn by the magnetic pull of the floor. The stain was still there. The dark, organic shadow where the Pathiopedilum had first crashed into my life. I stood over it, studying the way the pigment had settled into the grain. It didn't look like damage anymore. It looked like a deepening. It was the only part of the floor that had any character, the only square foot of the apartment that told a true story. To sand it down would be to erase the moment I finally woke up. It was a scar, yes, but scars are just proof that you survived the impact. The lock turned with a heavy, deliberate click. Jules didn't knock. We were past the point of formalities. She stepped inside, bringing the outside air with her. A gust of cool wind, the smell of exhaust, and that persistent scent of green things growing in the dark. She carried a bag of takeout and a bottle of wine that looked cheap. She kicked off her boots by the door, leaving them in a casual pile that ruined the strict symmetry of the entryway. She saw me staring at the floor. She paused, the wine bottle dangling from her hand, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read my posture. "I can bring the sander over tomorrow," she offered, her voice soft. "We can strip it back, make it like it never happened." I looked from the dark stain to her. She was wearing a sweater with a snag in the shoulder. Her hair was a disaster of wind-blown knots, and she was the most vital thing I had ever seen. "No," I said, the words solid in my mouth. "Leave it. I like the patina." Jules smiled, a slow, unfolding expression that changed the room's entire atmosphere. She walked over to me, stepping right onto the stain, her socks muting the sound of her approach. She handed me the wine, her fingers brushing mine, a lingering contact that sent a familiar spike of heat through my chest. "Patina," she repeated, testing the word. "That's a fancy word for permanent damage, Elena." "It's a fancy word for history," I corrected. I leaned into her, allowing the contact, allowing the uncertainty. We moved to the living room to fill the space. We ate from cartons on the coffee table, risking grease stains and water rings. We let the silence be comfortable rather than empty. I looked around my apartment. The lines were still clean, the lighting still calibrated, but the energy had shifted. The air wasn't static anymore. It was circulating, fed by the respiration of the plants on the counter and the woman laughing on my couch. I realized then that precision is just a way of dying slowly, without making a mess. Love, like botany, is an open system. It requires cross-contamination. You have to let the foreign elements in if you want to grow. You have to be willing to be ruined, just a little bit, to finally be real. The orchid sits on the floor now, right on top of the dark stain, thriving in the imperfection. Its roots are spreading, claiming the space, drinking the light. You can spend a lifetime preserving a breathless, empty room. Or you can open the door and let the wild things grow. If you've ever let someone ruin your plans for the better, subscribe and tell me about your beautiful mess in the comments.